This video will focus on Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and the philosophical system known as Utilitarianism. The text Utilitarianism, written by John Stuart Mill in 1863, is a type of hedonism. You see that here. And hedonism is the philosophy that happiness or pleasure is the most important thing in life. Utilitarianism argues that what is good, what is moral, and what is right is what provides the greatest good in terms of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. This is a way of weighing up the pros and cons, the costs and benefits, in order to determine what to do. Likely, all humans do this quite instinctively. We weigh up the expected happiness we would receive from some possible behavior, the expected displeasures we might receive from that behavior, and then choose what will provide us the greatest benefit in terms of happiness and pleasure. Cost benefits analysis in business or even in politics or the military are also using a utilitarian framework. For example, if politicians debate whether or not to legislate in favor of universal health care, they make those decisions on a utilitarian analysis. Take, for example, former President Obama's Affordable Care Act. The benefit, the good, the pleasure that people would receive from having health care was decided that it outweighed the displeasure people would have if there was a penalty in terms of a fine they would have to pay if they did not purchase health care. Thus, the benefit in terms of pleasure of giving people health care and everything else that went with it was determined to counterbalance effectively the displeasure of forcing people to pay a fine if they did not maintain health care. There are other versions of utilitarian cost-benefit analyses too. For example, when the United States of America decided in the 1940s to drop nuclear weapons on the Japanese towns Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that decision was made according to a utilitarian analysis. Those making the decision decided that, supposedly, to save the lives of 1 million American service personnel who would have otherwise had to invade the Japanese homeland, that if we dropped bombs killing around 250,000 Japanese civilians in manufacturing towns Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that saving the lives of 1 million Americans outweighed the nuclear vaporization of 250,000 Japanese civilians. And so, if the final utilitarian analysis displays that killing 250,000 people to save 1 million is what's likely to result, then the right, good, and moral thing to do is to drop nuclear weapons on women and children. the United States of America did drop leaflets, I believe, telling the inhabitants of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we're going to bomb you. But the ultimate decision to drop nuclear weapons on not only men, but women and children, real non-combatants, was made, and it can be justified as moral to use nuclear weapons on women and children according to a utilitarian framework. What this should indicate to us is that while this framework of weighing up the costs and benefits is completely normal, it can be justified it can be used to justify atrocities. The reason why is what you see in the middle of your screen. That utilitarianism lacks any means or mechanism to protect what we could call the inherent dignity of the individual. All warfare can be justified according to a utilitarian analysis. The use of nuclear weapons, the existence of prisons, death penalties, all of these can be used to can be justified according to a utilitarian analysis. Because if greater pleasure is served to a greater number of people, but that's built on the backs of the incredible suffering of one or a few, that suffering of one or a few can be justified if it serves the interest of the quote-unquote greatest good. Utilitarianism is sometimes referred to as operating on a greatest good or greatest happiness principle. There's a thought experiment that I still have not determined if it's something that happened in the real world or purely hypothetical. Either way, let's go through it in order to understand utilitarianism as an ethical system, both with its benefits and its significant drawbacks. The refugees in the attic thought experiment involves Jewish families in Europe during the World War II, fleeing as refugees from Nazi occupation. And the story goes that some 20 Jewish refugees were hiding in the attic of a French person during the Nazi occupation of France. And the Nazis come knocking on the door, and the French homeowner opens the door. And the French homeowner is asked by the Nazi, "Are you hiding anyone here?" And the homeowner says, "No." The Nazi says, "Well, we'll search around just to make sure." Now, up in the attic are 20 Jewish refugees hiding, trying to be as quiet as possible so as not to alert the Nazi to their presence. But one of these Jewish refugees is a young mother with an infant child who's sick because they've been fleeing through the winter in the cold outdoors of northern France. And this sick baby starts to cough and cry. And the mother has to make a choice. Let her baby cough and cry inconsolably, or cover over the mouth of the baby, ultimately suffocating it, killing the infant for the purpose of saving the lives of the 19 others. And you would ask, what is right to do? Is it right to smother an infant, suffocating it? Or is it right to let the baby cry and all 20 go to the death camps? As horrific as it sounds, what utilitarianism allows us to do is make the judgment that in that circumstance, the right thing to do is to suffocate the infant. There is not a single other ethical system that we could possibly imagine that could say the right thing to do is to kill a child. But in fact, this is how we likely actually go about making our moral determinations. We weigh up the good, weigh up the bad, and take the course of action that maximizes the good in terms of pleasure and happiness, ideally for the most number of people, and minimizes the bad. I'll let you debate out in the discussion session how you might make sense of that challenging thought experiment. On the next slide, I'll deal with what's called the trolley car problem, another famous philosophical utilitarian thought experiment. But before I do, I did want to go through what's called the Hedonic Calculus. Jeremy Bentham lists, it should be 7, I've duplicated number 2 here, lists 7 factors to consider when making our hedonic calculation, our utilitarian calculation. First, we should consider the intensity of the pleasure or pain. A more intense pleasure carries more weight than a less intense pleasure. A more intense pain has more recommending against it than a less intense pain. More intense pleasure, good. Less intense, less good. More intense pain, very bad. Less intense pain, not as bad. We should consider the duration. A pleasure that lasts over a long period is better than one that only lasts a short time. And a pain that will be sustained for a long time is worse than one that will only last for a very short time. What should be number 3 is that we should consider the certainty of the pleasure or pain. A pleasure that we can be certain to attain is one that's better than one that is better than one we might only possibly attain. And a pain that we will certainly incur is worse than one that we only might incur. The propinquity is a fancy word that means its nearness or farness. So, a pleasure that will be attained sooner is better than one that's farther off. A pain that will come sooner is worse than one that's farther off. The reason why is that if the pleasure or pain is distant in the future, intervening factors may change the likelihood that we will experience that pleasure or pain. So better to have something that happens soon, and therefore with more certainty, and worse to have a pain that is soon to come than one that's far off that might reasonably be avoided. The fecundity is a beautiful word we don't often see in English anymore. That means how likely a pleasure is to be followed by similar pleasures, and how likely a pain is to be followed by similar pains. It's like a multiplier effect. Take, for example, to use an extreme case, if you had the choice between getting up and going to your 8 a.m. college class, or not going and shooting up intravenous drugs. Now, that should be an obvious choice, which is the better thing to do, which is good, which is moral, which is right, which provides the greater happiness. But understand why that's an easy choice to make. College has a high fecundity. The little bit of pleasure or slight pain you might feel at going to an 8 a.m. class is likely to cause greater pleasures over the course of a lifetime. Better job prospects, higher pay, more likely to have fulfilling, rewarding work, and more likely to receive vacation hours, things like that. Whereas intravenous drug use has a number of negative multiplier effects. It has a negative fecundity. Whatever pleasure one may get from intravenous drug use in the short term is more than counterbalanced by the negatives that occur in the long term. In my classes, I like to use the example of a drug that was making the rounds a few years ago called crocodile. Crocodile was a mixture of, I think, black tar heroin with like diesel gasoline and turpentine. It was the stupidest thing you could possibly put in your body, but it was cheap. And people would get high for an hour or so. And then, not long after using not much of this horrific drug, the skin would literally start to rot off their bones. And it's called crocodile because it would make their skin all scaly and necrosis. Take bath salts as another example. Whatever small benefit might be gained from these drugs, the costs, the disadvantages, the displeasures add up way too fast to do anything to counteract what pleasure one may receive. Of course, people who are taking drugs, especially like that, aren't thinking rationally. And utilitarianism supposedly is a dispassionate rationality, as the nuclear bomb or the refugees in the attic thought experiment displayed. Moving on to the last two, purity and extent. A more pure pleasure is better than one that's mixed with pain. A more pure pain is worse than one that's mixed with some pleasure. And lastly, the extent is how many people it affects. This is the greatest number of people up at the top. A pleasure that makes more people happy is better than one that only affects a few. And something that will make more people unhappy is worse than one that will only make a few people unhappy. Consider what that means for nuclear weapons and prisons, etc. We'll go on and also deal with the trolley car problem, trolley car thought experiment. The way this works is that there's a train speeding down the track, and it's set to run over 5 people who are tied up on the track and who you can't get to, nor can you signal the train effectively to stop it. The only option you have available to you is to pull the switch, change the tracks, and cause the trolley to come over here and run over 1 person instead of 5. What should you do? It seems obvious to answer that the right course of action is to pull the lever, saving the lives of the 5 people, but actively sacrificing the 1 who would have lived. Understand the mind-boggling implication is that the right thing to do is to cause the train to run over somebody. But in the context of the thought experiment, we've trapped ourselves where you can either have the train run over 5 people or only run over 1. And in that context, the logical, rational thing to do is to sacrifice the life of the 1 to save the 5. This is the exact same as the refugees in the attic or the nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Great displeasure, pain, suffering, death, irrevocable death. To the few, to benefit the greater majority. In the most horrifying example, likely it's just this sort of logic that the Nazis responsible for the Holocaust had in mind when they took what they considered undesirables, Jews, gays, Roma, gypsies, disabled, liquidated them, sacrificing the few for the betterment of the many. Das Volk, the German people. The great downside of utilitarianism is that it can be used to justify the most horrific atrocities imaginable. And on the other hand, it justifies universal health care. It justifies reasonable gun control laws. It justifies speed limits. It justifies the entirety of our legal and political system, and all the good that it actually does do. When I think of utilitarianism, and I think when others think of utilitarianism, we think of cost-benefit analyses. I think the word might actually be analyses. And we do this, I think, instinctively. The fact that it can lead to horrible atrocity, on the one hand, is morally compelling to deal with. If we can justify atrocity through this system, is it a good system? That's a question I leave for you. I don't intend to be able to answer. However, we're considerably stuck with utilitarianism. It's unavoidable. We make use of it whether we realize it or not every day. What college should I go to? Who should I date or marry? Should I have children? We make these decisions according to cost-benefit analyses. And I'm also perfectly happy, capable, and confident of arguing that it's a good system for dealing with these. Likely and certainly not perfect. But what do we do with that moral ambivalence? The ability to use this system legitimately for legitimately good results, but also its ability to be used for horrific results. As we've gone through the semester, what we've seen are a variety of ethical systems. Utilitarianism takes its place alongside Kantian categorical imperatives, Aristotelian virtue ethics, Confucian virtue ethics, Buddhist ethics, a variety of religious ethics, Hammurabi's Code, and we'll see a few other ethical systems before we're finished. I think there are two ways a person could make sense of the variety of ethical systems that exist in the history of the thought of the Western world. On the one hand, a person could pick or choose, either moment by moment, what ethical system they want to follow. It likely has some very possible negative consequences. But it's not inherently inappropriate, not necessarily. Or one could weigh up and say, I think the Kantian categorical imperative is ideal. Or I think Aristotle's virtues are ideal. Or I think utilitarianism, at the final result, is best, superior. But whether or not we rank them or choose between them, at the very least, what our study of them could indicate to us is that there is a variety. Determining what is ethical is open to a variety of interpretations. There are a number of different systems, and at the very least we could recognize that there are a set of different ways by which one may choose to make ethical decisions. That ethics doesn't appear to be one size fits all. And you can argue that it should be, or that that's a good thing. It's not at all an easy question. What is ethical? But at the very least, what we've seen is that there are a number of ways in which people and cultures have answered that question. And that's good enough for us for now.